That wasn't a negotiation, Ava Brooks said quietly. It was a death threat. The laughter died so fast it almost sounded physical. 1 second earlier, the 48th floor boardroom of Whitmore Capital had been filled with low chuckles, clinking water glasses, and the smug confidence of people used to controlling every room they entered. The next, the air turned cold. Rain streaked down the massive glass windows behind them, blurring the Manhattan skyline into silver smears of light. Daniel Whitmore slowly leaned back in his leather chair, one hand resting near the untouched espresso beside him. His expensive gray suit looked sharp enough to cut glass, and the gold watch at his wrist flashed beneath the chandelier light as he studied Ava for the first time all evening. "Excuse me?" he asked, calm but dangerous. Ava stood near the wall beside the presentation screen, still holding the translation headset she'd worn for the last 2 hours. Her dark navy blazer was plain compared to the designer suits surrounding her, and the silence she carried around herself had made her nearly invisible from the moment she entered the room. Nearly. A younger investor near the end of the table smirked. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "She's the assistant translator." Another executive chuckled softly. Maybe she misunderstood. Ava didn't react. She simply reached toward the tablet on the conference table and replayed the audio recording that had arrived moments earlier from the Russian delegation waiting overseas. Static crackled through the speakers before a man's voice filled the room again. Low, calm, unreadable to almost everyone there. Daniel gave a dismissive wave. "We've already wasted enough time on this." But Ava spoke over him. He said the witnesses would disappear after the contracts are finalized. The room froze again. A woman near the windows slowly lowered her pen. Someone else stopped typing. Even the air conditioning seemed louder now. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained smooth. "That's a serious accusation." Ava finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady, but something inside them looked tired, like a person who had spent years carrying things nobody else wanted to hear. "It's not an accusation," she said. "It's a translation." One of the lawyers laughed nervously. "You're telling us $1 billion international deal is actually some kind of conspiracy?" Ava pressed pause on the recording. "I'm telling you the phrase he used doesn't mean remove obstacles. In military Russian, it means eliminate liabilities permanently." Silence spread across the room inch by inch. Daniel's confident posture shifted almost invisibly, just enough for Ava to notice. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan, low and distant. The lights inside the boardroom reflected against the rain-streaked glass, trapping everyone inside a cold mirror of themselves. Daniel folded his hands slowly. "And how exactly would you know military Russian?" A faint breath escaped Ava's lips. "Not fear. Memory. Because before this job," she said quietly, "I translated battlefield interrogations for the U.S. Army." No one laughed after that. No one spoke for nearly 5 seconds. In a room built for billion-dollar confidence, 5 seconds felt enormous. Daniel Whitmore slowly turned his chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Rainwater crawled down the glass in crooked silver lines, distorting the city below into something colder and less certain. Behind him, executives exchanged nervous glances without saying a word. Ava Brooks remained standing near the edge of the conference table, one hand lightly gripping the translation headset. Her fingers were steady now, but her heartbeat still echoed hard against her ribs. She had spent years learning how to hide fear inside silence. Daniel finally leaned forward again, elbows resting against polished black marble. "You are telling me," he said carefully, "that our overseas partners casually admitted criminal intent over a recorded line?" Ava nodded once. "Not casually. Confidently." One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "That interpretation could destroy negotiations if it is wrong." Ava looked toward him. "It could destroy people if it is right." The sentence landed heavily across the room. Daniel studied her face again, slower this time. Earlier that evening, she had barely existed to him. Just another quiet black woman assigned to sit against the wall and translate technical language no one else cared enough to understand. He remembered one of the investors joking before the meeting started. "She has not spoken in an hour. Maybe we should check if she is actually plugged in." The room had laughed then. Even Daniel had smiled faintly without looking up from his phone. Now nobody seemed eager to speak at all. A soft buzz came from the center of the conference table as another message arrived from Moscow. The screen lit up instantly. Incoming call. Every eye shifted toward it. Daniel's jaw flexed once before he muted the notification. No one answers anything yet, he ordered quietly. Ava lowered the headset onto the marble surface with deliberate care. The tiny plastic click echoed louder than it should have. There is more, she said. A younger executive frowned. More. Ava inhaled slowly. The cold recycled air inside the room carried the scent of espresso, leather, and expensive cologne, but beneath it she could still smell rain drifting through the slight crack near the windows. It reminded her of another building years ago, another room where powerful men spoke carelessly because they assumed no one listening mattered. The phrase he used about liabilities, she continued, was not corporate language. It was military cleanup terminology. One of the investors shook his head immediately. This is insane. But another man near the far end of the table suddenly straightened in his seat. Victor Levin, Russian-born, silent through most of the meeting. His face had gone pale beneath the chandelier light. Ava noticed before anyone else did. Daniel noticed a second later. Victor, Daniel said slowly, you speak Russian. The room turned toward him. Victor adjusted his cuff nervously before answering. Not fluently anymore. Ava held his gaze. But enough to know I am right. Victor said nothing. That silence was answer enough. The air inside the boardroom seemed to tighten all at once. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the windows, loosening his tie for the first time that night. 30 stories below, headlights crawled through rain-soaked streets like rivers of white and red. He stared at the city for several long seconds before speaking again. Who exactly are we doing business with? Ava's expression did not change. That, she said quietly, is the first question you should have asked before inviting them into this building. The boardroom no longer felt powerful. It felt trapped. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless near the rain-streaked windows while the city glowed cold beneath him. Behind his reflection in the glass, 20 executives sat frozen around the marble table, their confidence fading inch by inch beneath the weight of Ava Brooks' words. Victor Levin loosened his collar with shaky fingers. A thin sheen of sweat reflected beneath the chandelier light above him. Daniel turned slowly. Tell me she is wrong. Victor swallowed hard, but did not answer immediately. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Finally, he looked down at the darkwood table instead of at Daniel. The phrase exists, he admitted quietly. In military circles. One of the attorneys leaned forward sharply. Victor, what exactly are you saying? Victor rubbed his forehead once before speaking again. I am saying she translated it correctly. The room erupted into overlapping voices at once. Questions. Denials. Nervous laughter that sounded forced and thin. Daniel slammed his palm against the marble table hard enough to silence everyone instantly. Enough. His voice cut through the room like steel. Silence crashed back down. Ava remained near the far wall, shoulders still, expression unreadable. She had seen this moment before. Powerful people always looked the same when certainty left them. Smaller somehow. Human. Daniel stared at her across the room. Why did you not say something earlier? Ava answered without hesitation. Because no one here was listening earlier. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman lowered her eyes entirely. Daniel inhaled slowly through his nose. Earlier that night, Ava had entered through the side door, carrying translation files and technical binders, while conversations stopped just long enough for people to notice her skin before ignoring her again. Someone had mistaken her for catering staff. Another executive had handed her an empty coffee cup without even looking at her face. She remembered every second of it. Not because it hurt anymore. Because it was familiar. Daniel walked back toward the center of the room, his expensive Italian shoes muffled against the carpet. You said you worked military intelligence. Ava nodded once. 5 years. Why leave? For the first time all night, something flickered behind Ava's calm expression. Not weakness. Exhaustion. Because after a while, she said softly, you stop hearing words. You only hear consequences. The room fell quiet again. Rain tapped steadily against the glass like distant fingertips. Daniel studied her more carefully now. The plain navy blazer. The silver pin clipped neatly inside her folder. The exhaustion around her eyes that no amount of professionalism could completely hide. He realized something uncomfortable then. Ava Brooks had probably been the smartest person in the room all evening, and they had laughed at her silence. A A sudden vibration buzzed across the conference table again. Another incoming call from Moscow. This time nobody moved toward it. Victor stared at the screen like it might explode. Daniel looked toward Ava. If we answer, he asked carefully, what happens? Ava's eyes shifted toward the glowing screen for one long second. They will know we understood the message. One of the investors whispered under his breath, my God. Daniel muted the call again immediately. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan, low and heavy enough to rattle the windows faintly. Then another voice spoke quietly from near the end of the table. There is something else. Everyone turned toward Victor. His face had gone completely pale now. He looked at Ava before speaking again, almost reluctantly. The man on that recording, he paused. He used Daniel's name personally. Daniel's expression hardened. Meaning? Victor's throat tightened visibly. Meaning this was never just business. He looked directly at Daniel now. You were the target. The temperature inside the boardroom seemed to drop. After Victor Levin spoke those final words. You were the target. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their phones anymore. Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of the marble table with one hand pressed flat against the polished surface, his reflection fractured beneath the chandelier light. For years, men had lowered their voices when he entered rooms. Investors chased his approval. Politicians returned his calls within minutes. But now a quiet black woman standing beside a presentation screen had turned his entire world uncertain in less than 20 minutes. Daniel looked toward Ava slowly. How long did you know? Ava's expression remained calm. Since the second recording. One of the attorneys blinked in confusion. Second recording? Ava stepped forward and reached for the conference tablet. Her movements were measured, careful, almost graceful beneath the tension suffocating the room. She tapped the screen once, and another audio file appeared. Timestamped 11 minutes earlier. Daniel frowned immediately. That file never came through legal review. No, Ava replied quietly. It came through mine. The room went silent again. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred rivers of silver and black. Ava pressed play. A burst of static filled the speakers before another Russian voice emerged. Sharper this time. More direct. Several executives glanced nervously toward Victor, waiting for him to translate. But he looked frozen in his chair. Ava did not wait. He says the American believes he is untouchable, she translated evenly. He says once the contracts are signed, Daniel Whitmore will become the perfect public scapegoat. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. Why was this hidden from me? Ava turned toward him fully now. Because your executive team assumed I was only here to carry translation notes. Nobody breathed for a moment. A younger investor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. Earlier that evening, that same man had laughed when Ava entered carrying binders against her chest. Careful, he had joked. Those probably cost more than your salary. The memory flashed briefly across Ava's mind, but her face never changed. Daniel looked around the room slowly, his frustration darkening by the second. Who screened these communications? One attorney cleared his throat weakly. The International Division. Which means none of you actually understood what was being said. Nobody answered him. That silence felt louder than shouting. Ava lowered the tablet carefully back onto the table. There is another problem. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. Of course there is. Ava looked toward the rain outside before continuing. The man speaking in the recordings was not just threatening you. Victor suddenly looked up. Fear moved visibly across his face now. Ava. She ignored him gently. He referenced someone inside this building. Daniel's eyes narrowed instantly. Inside this building? Ava nodded once. Someone feeding them internal information. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. One executive muttered, "That is impossible." Ava's voice remained calm enough to make it worse. Then why did they know the exact timing of tonight's vote before the agenda was finalized? No one had an answer. Daniel slowly straightened to his full height. The city lights behind him cast long shadows across the boardroom floor, turning every face around the table pale beneath the cold white light. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore no longer looked like the most powerful person in the room. Ava noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. Victor suddenly pushed back from the table hard enough for his chair to scrape against the floor. "We need to leave," he whispered. Daniel stared at him sharply. "Leave?" Victor looked toward the darkened windows with visible panic rising in his eyes. If they know we understood the recordings, he swallowed hard. Then they already know she translated them. Slowly, every eye in the room turned toward Ava Brooks. The room changed after everyone looked at Ava Brooks. Not just emotionally, physically. The marble boardroom that had felt warm with money and arrogance an hour earlier now felt narrow, airless, almost claustrophobic. Rain battered the windows in restless waves while the lights of Manhattan flickered against the glass like distant warnings. Ava stood completely still near the conference screen, but she could feel the tension moving toward her from every direction. Daniel Whitmore noticed it too. Fear had entered the room, and fear always needed somewhere to land. Victor Levin wiped his trembling hands against his trousers before speaking again. If they know she translated the recordings, he whispered, then they know she can expose everything. One of the executives shot up from his chair immediately. Then we need security on this floor now. Another voice cut in sharply. Or maybe we need to stop assuming this is real. Daniel turned toward the speaker. Martin Keller, senior legal advisor. White-haired, expensive cufflinks gleaming beneath the chandelier light. He had barely spoken all evening until now. Martin adjusted his tie calmly and looked directly at Ava. With all due respect, Daniel, we are making decisions based entirely on one translator's interpretation. The room shifted again. Ava recognized the tone instantly. It was the same tone people used when they wanted truth to sound inconvenient. Martin folded his hands on the table. Ava Brooks is not an intelligence analyst anymore. She is an assistant contractor working temporary assignments. His eyes moved over her carefully. And frankly, emotional conclusions can happen under pressure. Daniel's expression darkened slightly, but he did not interrupt. Martin continued smoothly. We are talking about international investments worth $4.2 billion. We cannot destroy negotiations because someone became frightened by aggressive phrasing. A few executives nodded weakly, relieved someone had finally challenged her. Ava stayed silent for several seconds, long enough for Martin to believe he had regained control of the room. Then she looked at him calmly. You already knew what the recordings meant. Martin's face froze. The room went dead quiet. Daniel turned sharply toward him. What? Ava stepped away from the wall for the first time all evening. Her heels moved softly across the carpet while every eye followed her. You interrupted me 3 times whenever I translated military terminology, she said quietly. Not because you thought I was wrong. Her eyes locked onto Martin's. Because you understood enough Russian to know I was right. Martin laughed once, but the sound came out thin. That is absurd. Ava did not blink. You also stopped Victor from answering the first time Daniel asked him to translate. Victor slowly looked up from his chair, stunned she had noticed. Ava continued in the same calm voice. Then you pushed to finalize the contract before the second recording finished playing. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. Martin's composure began cracking around the edges now. You are reaching. Ava shook her head once. No, I am observing. The silence that followed felt brutal. Rainwater streaked across the giant windows, while thunder rolled low over the city. Daniel stepped closer to Martin slowly. Do you speak Russian? Martin hesitated 1 second too long. Ava saw Daniel notice immediately. So did everyone else. Martin finally exhaled sharply. Conversationally. Interesting, Daniel said coldly. Because you told this board 3 years ago you needed a translator during the St. Petersburg negotiations. Martin's face drained of color. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away anymore. Ava could hear the quiet hum of the recessed ceiling lights above them and the faint clicking of rain against glass 50 stories above Manhattan. Daniel's voice lowered dangerously. Tell me something, Martin. He leaned one hand against the marble table beside him. Why does the woman you mocked all night seem to know more about my company than my own legal advisor? Martin opened his mouth to answer, but before a single word came out, every screen inside the boardroom suddenly went black. Darkness swallowed the boardroom so suddenly that several people gasped before they could stop themselves. The giant screens lining the walls blinked black all at once, cutting off charts, contracts, stock projections, and the frozen image of the Moscow call log. Only the soft emergency lights near the floor remained glowing, casting long shadows across the marble and glass. Rain continued hammering against the windows 50 stories. Above Manhattan, louder now in the sudden silence. Nobody moved at first. The room felt suspended between seconds. Then a nervous voice whispered, "What just happened?" Daniel Whitmore immediately reached for his phone, but the signal bars vanished the moment the screen lit up. Around the table, executives checked their own devices with growing panic. No service. No internet. No connection. Martin Keller slowly stood from his chair. This building has backup systems. But even he sounded less certain now. Ava Brooks remained near the conference table, her face dimly illuminated by the pale blue glow of the emergency lights. She was not looking at the dead screens. She was looking at Martin, watching him. Daniel noticed. "You expected something," he said sharply. Martin turned immediately. "Do not be ridiculous." Ava finally spoke. "Then why are you not surprised?" The question landed softly, but it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Martin adjusted his suit jacket with stiff movements. Because systems failed during storms. Outside, lightning flashed across the skyline, briefly illuminating the entire room in cold white light. For 1 second, every face looked exposed. Tired, frightened, human. Then darkness settled again. Victor Levin suddenly pushed away from the table. "No," he whispered. "This is not weather." Daniel stepped toward him. "Explain." Victor rubbed a shaking hand across his mouth before answering. "In Moscow, before operations move forward, communication channels are isolated first." One of the younger investors stared at him. "Operations?" Victor looked physically sick now. "They do not like loose ends." The room went silent again. Ava could hear the soft ticking of Daniel's gold watch as he stood only a few feet away now. Funny, she thought. Earlier that night, he had barely acknowledged her existence. Now his eyes tracked every word she spoke like survival depended on it. Maybe it did. Daniel lowered his voice carefully. "Ava." It was the first time he had said her name all evening. "Tell me exactly what you think is happening." Ava inhaled slowly. The recycled air inside the boardroom smelled colder now, touched faintly by electricity and rain. She glanced toward the dark windows before answering. "I think someone wanted this deal signed tonight before questions were asked." Martin scoffed immediately. "This is paranoia." Ava ignored him. "And now I think someone realized the wrong person heard the recordings." Daniel's expression hardened. "You?" Ava nodded once. The silence after that felt unbearable. A woman near the far end of the table quietly crossed her arms tighter against herself, though the room was not cold. Fear only made it feel that way. Then, from somewhere beyond the boardroom doors, footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway. Slow. Measured. Everyone heard them. The sound grew closer against the polished floors outside. Martin's face changed instantly. Not panic exactly. Recognition. Ava saw it before anyone else did. Daniel saw it a second later. "You know who that is," Ava said quietly. Martin looked toward the door, but said nothing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the boardroom. Complete silence followed. Then came a soft electronic beep from the locked entry panel beside the door. Someone on the outside was overriding security access. 1 click. 2 clicks. The heavy boardroom doors slowly began to open. Every person in the room held their breath. But Ava did not look afraid anymore. She looked certain. The boardroom doors opened slowly enough to make every second feel deliberate. Cold hallway lights spilled across the carpet in pale stripes, while rain thundered against the windows behind them. Nobody inside the room moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then a man stepped through the doorway wearing a dark charcoal overcoat dampened by the storm outside. Mid-60s. Gray beard. Calm eyes. The kind of face built from years of making difficult decisions without emotion attached to them. 2 building security officers stood several feet behind him, uncertain and visibly nervous. The older man removed a black leather glove slowly and glanced around the room like he already knew everyone inside it. Then his eyes landed on Ava Brooks. And to everyone's shock, he gave a small respectful nod. Martin Keller's face turned almost white beneath the emergency lights. "You were not supposed to come here," he whispered. The older man ignored him completely. Daniel Whitmore stepped forward immediately. "Who are you?" The man looked toward him calmly. "Someone who tried to stop this deal before your legal department buried the warnings." His voice carried a faint Russian accent, low and controlled. Ava watched Daniel's expression harden with confusion. "You know him?" Daniel asked Martin sharply. Martin did not answer. The older man answered instead. "He knows exactly who I am." He reached inside his coat slowly enough not to alarm anyone and removed a slim folder sealed in dark blue leather. "My name is Anton Vulov," he said. Several faces around the room shifted instantly at the name. Even Victor Levin looked stunned. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Volkov International. Anton nodded once. Formerly. The room fell silent again. Ava recognized the name immediately. One of the wealthiest energy conglomerates in Eastern Europe. Powerful enough to influence governments. Dangerous enough to disappear from headlines overnight. Daniel stared at him carefully. Your company disappeared 6 years ago. No, Anton replied quietly. It was stolen. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the entire boardroom in white for half a second before darkness returned. Anton stepped farther into the room and placed the leather folder carefully on the marble conference table. The men you were negotiating with tonight are not legitimate investors. He looked directly at Daniel. They are using your company to move assets through American infrastructure before federal investigators freeze their accounts overseas. One executive muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Daniel slowly opened the folder. Inside sat pages of financial records, transaction trails, and photographs. Martin took a sudden step backward. Ava noticed immediately. Anton noticed too. 3 years ago, Anton continued calmly, someone inside Whitmore Capital began feeding them internal legal structures. His eyes shifted toward Martin. Someone very expensive. Martin's composure finally cracked. This is insanity. But his voice shook now. Daniel looked up from the folder slowly. These account signatures belong to you. Martin immediately turned toward the room. You cannot seriously believe this. Ava spoke quietly before anyone else could answer. The recordings were never warnings. Everyone looked toward her. She met Daniel's eyes directly. They were leverage. Daniel's face tightened as understanding finally settled across it. Ava continued softly. They knew Martin would panic if someone translated the calls correctly. Anton gave another small nod toward Ava. Respect again. Real respect this time. She understood faster than anyone in this room, he said. Martin suddenly slammed both hands against the marble table. You are all making a catastrophic mistake. But nobody seemed afraid of him anymore. That was the moment everything changed. Daniel slowly closed the leather folder and looked at Ava for a long time beneath the dim emergency lighting. Hours earlier, she had been invisible to him. Another quiet black contractor standing against the wall while powerful people ignored her existence. Now she was the only reason his company still existed at all. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost like the weight of the room had finally shifted onto his shoulders. Then he looked toward building security near the doorway. Mr. Keller is finished here, he said quietly. No one argued when building security stepped toward Martin Keller. That was the part that stunned him most. 20 minutes earlier, people in that room would have defended him instantly. They would have dismissed Ava Brooks as emotional, difficult, or mistaken before they ever questioned a senior legal advisor in a $10,000 suit. But power had shifted now, quietly and completely. Martin looked around the boardroom like a man searching for allies and finding only reflections of himself in the dark glass windows. Rain continued sliding down the skyline behind him while the emergency lights painted tired shadows across every face in the room. Daniel, Martin said carefully, trying to regain control of his voice. You cannot seriously trust outsiders over your own executive team. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless near the conference table, one hand resting beside the blue leather folder Anton Vulov had delivered. He no longer looked angry. Somehow that was worse. You stopped trusting this company long before tonight, Daniel replied quietly. You just assumed nobody would notice. Martin opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out immediately. Ava watched him in silence from across the room. Not with satisfaction. Not even with resentment. Just clarity. She had spent most of her life watching powerful people underestimate quiet women, especially black women. They always mistook silence for absence. Martin finally looked directly at Ava. You think you won? His voice carried bitterness now, stripped of the smooth confidence he wore earlier that evening. Ava met his gaze calmly. This was never about winning. Martin laughed once under his breath. That is easy to say now. Ava shook her head slightly. No, easy would have been staying quiet. The room fell silent again. Daniel looked toward her slowly. Something shifted behind his expression then. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. Earlier that night, he had allowed the room to laugh at her. He had watched people dismiss her intelligence before she even opened her mouth. And he had done nothing because part of him had agreed with them. The realization sat heavily across his face now. Anton Vulov quietly closed the leather folder while security remained beside Martin near the doorway. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. The storm outside carried enough noise for everyone. Daniel finally stepped away from the table and crossed the room toward Ava. His expensive shoes moved softly against the carpet while every executive watched in complete silence. He stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough now to see the exhaustion behind her eyes. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. Ava frowned slightly. "What?" Daniel glanced briefly around the boardroom. "After the comments. The jokes. After they treated you like you did not belong here." Ava looked toward the rain-streaked windows for a moment before answering. "Because whether people listen or not does not change what is true." Nobody moved after she said it. The sentence settled heavily into the room, simple and undeniable. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly, almost embarrassed by the honesty in her voice. "I owe you an apology." Several executives looked stunned hearing those words come from him. Daniel Whitmore was not known for apologizing to anyone. Ava noticed it too, but she simply shook her head once. "You owe me respect," she said softly. "Not pity." Daniel absorbed the words without defending himself. For the first time in years, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man forced to confront who he had become. Martin suddenly pulled against the tension in the room one last time. "You are making a mistake trusting her." Ava turned toward him calmly before Daniel could respond. "No," she said quietly. "His mistake was not trusting me sooner." Silence followed her words. Deep. Final. Outside, the storm over Manhattan finally began to soften, and for the first time all night, the rain against the glass no longer sounded angry. 3 weeks later, the rain was gone. Manhattan moved beneath clear autumn skies. Sharp blue reflected across the glass towers lining Midtown like polished steel. Inside Whitmore Capitol, the 48th floor felt different now. Quieter. Not because people spoke less, but because they listened more carefully before they did. The boardroom doors remained open for the first time in years, and sunlight stretched across the marble floor where shadows and panic had once filled the room. Ava Brooks stood alone, near the windows, holding a thin stack of translated compliance reports against her chest. The city below moved in distant patterns of yellow taxis and slow morning traffic, muted beneath the thick glass. She had almost forgotten what silence could feel like when it was peaceful instead of lonely. Behind her, footsteps approached softly. Daniel Whitmore stopped several feet away, no longer dressed in the sharp charcoal suits he once wore like armor. Today his jacket hung loose over an open collar, the tension around his eyes replaced by something quieter. Tired, maybe. Honest, finally. Ava did not turn immediately. "You are early," she said calmly. Daniel glanced toward the skyline beside her reflection in the glass. "You are always early." A faint smile touched Ava's mouth for half a second before disappearing again. It was enough to surprise him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. Just real. Down the hall, employees moved through the office carrying coffee cups and legal folders, but nobody ignored Ava anymore. Some nodded respectfully when they passed her office. Others greeted her by name. The invisible woman from 3 weeks earlier no longer existed. Daniel finally handed her a small folder. The board approved it this morning. Ava opened it carefully. Her eyes moved across the first page. Director of International Risk Analysis. Permanent position. Full executive authority. She looked up slowly. Daniel watched her carefully, almost uncertain. "You earned it," he said quietly. Ava closed the folder again without speaking immediately. Sunlight reflected softly across the windows behind them, warming the room in pale gold instead of cold silver. "You know," Daniel said after a moment, "I used to think leadership meant being the loudest person in the room." Ava finally turned fully toward him. "Most people do." Daniel nodded once, accepting the truth inside her words. But the night everything almost collapsed, he paused briefly. The only person who actually saw what was happening was the person nobody bothered listening to. Ava lowered her eyes toward the folder in her hands. "Silence teaches you things," she said softly, "especially when people think you are powerless." Daniel looked out across the city again. "I think this company spent years rewarding the wrong voices." Ava studied him for a second before answering. "Then maybe now it has a chance